Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked. We are now into the second month of the US war in Iran. It's been an extremely dramatic couple of weeks. It's been an even more dramatic 24 hours in just the last day. President Trump has essentially declared victory. He says all the hard work has been done. The war could be wrapped up within the next 2 to 3 weeks. He's also claimed that Iran has proposed a ceasefire offer. The Iranians deny this. And he's even found time to have a jab at his European allies, saying that he may consider withdrawing America from NATO. Now, to make sense of all of this and the war in general, I am absolutely thrilled to be joined by Ryan Bodenheimer, aka Max Afterburner. Welcome, Ryan.
Hey, Fraser, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about this today. Lots of things going on in the world.
Absolutely crazy time, and no one better I can think of to talk to. For our viewers and listeners who may not be familiar with you, do you want to tell them a little bit about your background before we get into the broader discussion?
Yeah, for sure. So I was an Air Force fighter pilot for about 12 years total. I went to actually, it may be very topical today. I went to Euro-NATO joint jet pilot training after graduating from college. So I went through flight school with Norwegians, Germans, Italians, lots of members from the NATO coalition send their fighter pilots over to the US to train. So I was fortunate enough to go through that and emerged out of there, flew the F-15E, did 2 operational assignments. I flew in Afghanistan, flew 70 combat missions over there, doing close air support, specifically focused initially on working with top tier 1 teams, doing high value targeting in Afghanistan. And I came back from that, flew the F-15E a little more, and then got selected for the Thunderbirds actually, and then flew for 2 years on the Thunderbirds. Actually went to Fairford, flew an air show there, and got to experience, the beauty of the UK and enjoy that. And then from there, continued on the Thunderbirds until 2018. I was an instructor for the Thunderbirds as well, teaching follow-on fighter pilots how to execute those precision aerial demonstrations. I think I ended up doing about 150 air shows myself, transitioned to an instructor, and then after that, I left, became a commercial airline pilot for 5 years. And while I was doing that, I was kind of dabbling in social media, did a reaction to Top Gun Maverick, and I was thinking it would just be a hobby. And that reaction video ended up getting 3 million views or so on my YouTube channel over the course of a year. But I was riding the coattails of Top Gun Maverick 100%. And then I just started doing reactions to world events from an aviator, combat fighter pilot perspective. And I wanted to just tell the story of the warriors that are out there behind these wars. And something on my channel that I always focus on is I glamorize the warrior, not the war. I have my own thoughts on Iraq and Afghanistan, having served over there. But my passion to tell the story of the U.S. military is why I started my channel. And I've been very grateful to see the growth of the channel.
And it's a great channel. And on there, you've been documenting this war in particular, day by day, blow by blow. So I wondered if you could give your assessment of President Trump's claim that essentially, America has really won, or at least, the hard part is over. What's your take on that based on what you've seen so far?
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough when I was in the F-15E, my first assignment prior to deploying to Afghanistan, I was assigned to the plans department, which basically just means I was studying all the different conflicts we could be a part of. Now, we were preparing for Afghanistan, but as part of the plans operation, I was focused on the Taiwan Straits. I was focused on Iran and North Korea scenarios. So as fighter pilots in the F-15E, when we do our mission checks each year, we'll randomly get chosen one of those 3 operations typically, because the F-15E is very heavily relied upon aircraft. And so I started my study of the operational aspects of Iran pretty early on. But this has been an operational plan the U.S. has had for decades at this point. And so then when I came back from Afghanistan, I took over and became the chief of that department. And then my whole mission and my whole job was to teach the squadron Iran and how to go in and fight Iran, how to militarily degrade their ability to launch ballistic missiles, drones, and ultimately to keep them from having a nuclear weapon. But I got to see kind of the back end, a lot of the different intelligence. A lot of that's classified, but there's some that's not. And I got to teach that to my squadron. So what I think President Trump's getting at right now is likely the operational plan is probably getting pretty close to winding down. Now, the exact dates and times and the entire length of that plan is classified, but overall, it's what I saw was months, not weeks, as far as the plan goes. So President Trump saying we're ahead of schedule. I think he's probably, he's telling us the truth. There's things he can't divulge either, but seeing that militarily Iran being, relatively decimated, they still have some ability. We can get into that too. And we always kind of knew that would be the case, that they would fall back on their terrorist style tactics. After all, what I saw, this is just from the assessment of the intelligence, terrorism tactics is their main goal. They want plausible deniability. They want the ability to keep the regime in power by causing chaos and pain beyond the military takedown. So militarily, they knew they were going to be struck and taken down within a couple months or weeks. But that's not their last. That's not the only cards they have, right? So they fall back on terrorist and proxy tactics. And I think we're kind of seeing that play out. But militarily, as far as Iran, their military's ability to keep aircraft from flying in the airspace, my assessment is, militarily, it does have the option to wind down. Now, there's lots of other things that can happen after the actual military structure of the IRGC is taken out. And the IRGC is not going away, right? Like the IRGC is still there. There's 150 to 200,000 is the estimates that I've seen are the actual members of the IRGC. So just because they're militarily degraded doesn't mean just overnight they're going to lay down their weapons and surrender.
And sticking, on the military aspect for now, was it ever a fair fight? We saw very quickly how quickly the US was able to, decapitate the regime. It looks as if they have, quite clear air superiority. Did Iran ever have a chance on that front, or is this about where you'd expect it to be by now?
Yeah, I don't think they ever had a shot militarily. I think they knew, well, maybe they thought they would have a better shot than what they had. They were getting a lot of advanced systems, weaponry, and intelligence from China, from Russia, and those were their main systems. So they were hopeful that that initial wave would go better than what it went in June of 2025, or maybe it was April of 2025, basically Operation Midnight Hammer going in, striking the different military sites there. I think they wanted it to go better, but the U.S. military has specially designed units to take down surface-to-air missile systems, and those units are very highly capable. And Iran, I don't think they ever had a shot to take them down. So they realize now that ultimately they're going to have to fall back on their terrorist tactics.
And in terms of what might happen next, if the military action ramps up, we don't know. President Trump is expected to make an announcement within the next 24 hours on what happens next. But a lot of people have been talking about a potential next step for the US being Kharg Island. What's the significance of that? I'm sure people have heard about it in the news, but not quite understanding what it's about. Why is it significant to the regime? What might the US gain from doing it? And how risky would it be?
Yeah, so Kharg Island is where the Iranian oil operation really starts and ends. It's the main hub for the oil flow. It's kind of up in the northern part of the Persian Gulf, so it might be a little counterintuitive to people thinking that that's the most important strategic location. A lot of people are focused on the Straits of Hormuz, but the flow of oil is what keeps the regime propped up, and it's what's given them the ability to basically create one of the strongest militaries, if not the strongest military in the Middle East. Some of the reports I've seen are $100 million in revenue for each oil tanker that they ship to China. And a lot of that originates, I think pretty much all of that originates from Kharg Island, where the oil tankers are loaded up and then shipped through the Straits of Hormuz. And that's what really gives the IRGC the stronghold in the country, because what we've seen is hundreds likely of that mullah Ayatollah class being taken down, struck down by mainly Israel, but also the US. And so now who's going to come up into that power vacuum, right? It's not just like, okay, there's no power. No one's going to want power in Iran. These IRGC generals, these top leaders, the way that I've, kind of come to know them from studying them in, back vaults of the US military is they kind of operate like a mafia. So what does a mafia want? They want money, right? They got to have the money flow coming in. So if that money flow is shut off and they're not the ones receiving that money, let's say the US has more of a control over that, or NATO, then at that point, I think, and this is just, again, my opinion, if that money flow stops to the IRGC, then at some point the internal rumblings, the fractures in the regime could get bigger and bigger, and you could see some legitimate regime change happen. Now, as far as, and again, that's just an if, right? Because ultimately they're getting the money from other sources too. They have steel factories. They basically collect all the money from the population. Like the IRGC are the ones that are getting that money now that the mullah class seems to kind of have at least taken a back seat for now. Because remember, the IRGC, they're the ones that have their finger on the button for the ballistic missiles, for the drones. So logically, they're the ones that are basically going to be in power in Iran at this point. But when it comes to Kharg Island itself, now that's something that strategically, militarily, would be a blunder to just put troops there willy-nilly, right? To just, oh, we're taking Kharg Island, now we've occupied it. Okay, great. Now, if the US does that without a real plan for air supremacy would mean, all right, no drones are flying, no ballistic missiles are flying. And at that point, taking Kharg Island, yeah, okay, that could be a strategic win. But prior to that point, if you just had a mass of troops there that could be targeted by the drones or the ballistic missiles, I mean, Iran's not going to give it a second thought. They would gladly launch ballistic missiles and drones, this is my opinion, at Kharg Island, even though it's their own home territory, just to cause chaos and, basically make this war less and less palatable. Now, there's other options too, though. So we've got a Marine Expeditionary Unit in the area. There's rumors that there's hundreds, if not, in the thousands, special operators in the area as well. And they don't have to actually take that island to control a lot of what goes on there. There's other ways to do it. And U.S. special operations, they're the best in the world, in my opinion. Again, the UK's got some good ones too, don't worry. But ultimately, there's a lot of things they can do. These are big-brained people who are also super athletes. So, I mean, they've thought through this. And JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, is aware that they don't want to just put islands, or they don't want to just put members of U.S. forces on this island as sitting ducks and become hostages for Iran, right? That'd be a strategic win for them.
And how might Iran retaliate to something like that? You've suggested that they could, throw all their weight at, getting rid of any U.S. soldiers in the area. We've seen them attack Gulf states. Basically they're people who in the region who thought they wouldn't be attacked by Iran have been caught by surprise by that. What other options for retaliation does it have, even if America might be winning the war overall?
Well, so Iran, again, they're going to fall back on their terrorist mindset. So the mullah class, the Ayatollah, basically have created the ability for them to hold on to the regime as best they can by making this as painful as possible. So we've seen the ballistic missiles, we've seen the drones. Another thing that maybe some of your viewers don't know is the IRGC, they're the ones that actually were the instructors and the teachers of how to do roadside bomb operations, IEDs, improvised explosive devices. That's their go-to. And they actually trained a lot of the militias in Iraq and Afghanistan on how to do that. They're responsible for the deaths and the maiming of thousands of Americans. Now, I'm not going to sit here and debate the morality or justification for Iraq and Afghanistan. I think those were strategic blunders in a lot of ways, and we can get into that if you want. I mean, I flew overhead. I flew 70 combat missions there. I was proud to do it. I was proud to support our forces. But if you look at the strategic objectives there, I think there were a lot of special interests in the U.S. at the time that made a lot of money off of Iraq and Afghanistan. So again, but they could cause pain with the improvised explosive devices. That's why I'm the first one to say a massive ground operation going into Iran is just not a good idea. You've got thousands of these guys, mafia-style bosses. They're not afraid to kill their own people, right? We saw them. They've killed thousands of their own people. So them planting roadside bombs or IEDs everywhere they can would probably be one of their tactics.
And what would you say is the state of Iran's proxies? Because you mentioned their use of proxy tactics, and of course, the war has widened to involve Hezbollah, in particular. Israel is going in to invade Hezbollah. What's your assessment on that? Have those been degraded as well?
I think they've been degraded. Now, with the flow of money still going to the IRGC, they've got their ways to get resources and money to these different proxies. So the Houthis have spoken up, said, "Hey, we're here." They've launched ballistic missiles at Israel. They've been intercepted from what I've seen, but the proxies aren't completely done yet. I mean, they're still getting money, right? So as long as the IRGC is still getting that flow of cash, there's still going to be these proxy armies that, their life might be destitute and terrible. What do they have to lose? If they're getting some money from the IRGC, then there's probably like hundreds of thousands of these people that will just continue this as long as that money flow continues. So without that money flow being cut off, I think the proxies will still be there, but they're getting hammered as well. I mean, we've seen the A-10 operating in Iraq. I think that surprised a lot of people. We didn't think the A-10 would be strafing paramilitary forces that are backed by Iran in Iraq. And oh, by the way, they're on paper, they're a part of the Iraqi military, which is wild, right? But that's how deep Iran's claws have gotten into these different militias in Iraq, in Lebanon. I mean, so many different areas. There's a lot of influence from Iran still.
And we shouldn't forget that this is a joint operation with Israel. How coordinated has has the US-Israeli strikes been? Has that been? Would you say it's broadly been successful? Have they worked together well? Would you say?
Yeah, I don't know the inner workings, right? I'm a YouTuber, so I'm kind of taking and piecing all this together along with the viewers as well, and just using the experience I have to see how the operation is going. It seems like there was a little bit of disagreement on some of the strikes with some of the energy infrastructure, just from what we saw President Trump put out, saying that, okay, we're going to pause the strikes on energy infrastructure now. I think that was after Israel hit an oil depot near Tehran. So it seems like since that happened, what I've seen has just been better coordination. But as far as the overall coordination of the air war, from what I've heard, there's Israeli counterparts in the different headquarters for the U.S. and I don't know this, but likely vice versa as well, to coordinate. And the way that it happens with a massive air campaign like this is what's called an air tasking order. And this is something, so when I was in Afghanistan for almost about 3 weeks, I went to Qatar and I was at the base there in the headquarters coordinating the air tasking order for the F-15Es. So I was the F-15E representative there, talking to different coordinators for other airframes like B-1s, B-52s, allied partner nations as well were in that, the KAOC. That's the headquarters in Qatar for the U.S. military. So we would have discussions and chats about, okay, which airframes should take which targets, what are the most strategic targets, what's the ground forces commander's objective, and they would ask me, hey, can F-15Es do this? And oh, by the way, if we deconflict you, there's Eurofighters in the area as well. What kind of deconfliction plan makes the most sense as far as what times should these aircraft flow in? What times should the Eurofighters flow in? So that kind of coordination is probably happening very seamlessly at this point.
And of course, there's a group of allies that we brought up earlier who President Trump is not very happy with, the Europeans in NATO. Do you think he's being fair there? I mean, this is not a war that Europe chose to get involved with, but he's saying essentially it's the job of the Europeans to clean up the Strait of Hormuz. He's upset that he hasn't been given adequate support from the UK and France and countries like that. What's your take on that reaction from President Trump?
Well, I think it's leverage and it's negotiation, and a coalition's always better than unilateral or bilateral action, right? And Europe has a lot of talent. The military is solid. And so I think bringing in more forces to help contribute is just going to make this more decisive and more of a win for the long term. I think having skin in the game in an area that's close to Europe, it makes sense, and so I'm curious too, what is Europe's reason for not getting involved? Is there not enough, is the juice not worth the squeeze? Is the oil that could come through the Straits of Hormuz, is that something that Europe can do without? Or are there internal things in Europe? Why, Starmer, why is he not, stepping up and coming in to help? Are there internal factions in Europe? Is he afraid of Iranian sleeper cells? Is he afraid of not getting elected again based on the population disagreeing with this or not really understanding why we went into Iran? I think and this is a broad statement, okay? So just, I'm not stereotyping anybody, but I think maybe in the US, there's a little bit more of an understanding on why this happened, why we went in and did this. But I'm curious too. I want to know, why do Europeans see this as not something that's valuable? Because the information I've seen is, before the war kicked off, I think it was really shortly before it kicked off, and things were getting hot, things were heating up. The regime in Iran said that the UK's military was a terrorist organization. And whether that's just rhetoric or not, I mean, at some point, I don't know. I think if I was in Europe, I'd say, well, okay, you think we're a terrorist organization. What have we done to you? And for them to say that and make that claim, and then also have thousands of ballistic missiles, it's really tough, Fraser, to think of an objective that you're preventing something from happening down the line. And I get it. That's something that might be difficult for people to wrap their mind around. Wait, we're going to prevent a nuclear war from happening that we don't know is actually going to happen. But at some point, you have to use your discretion, your logic, and your common sense to say, well, okay, this organization has been shouting death to America, death to Israel. Now they're calling the UK's military a terrorist organization. Like, at some point, if they get the ability to launch a nuclear weapon, even if it's not at the UK, what if it's, a nuclear war that kicks off with Iran and Israel? And now that's pretty close to Europe, right? And then the US probably has to intervene in that. But again, it's something that it's preventing a worse scenario from happening later, which I get it. It's hard to understand. But I mean, my question, if you have time to answer that, would be, what's the sentiment in Europe, and how do people feel over there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the sort of broader population and and certainly the political class seem baffled by it. I think for the political class, it's a feigned bafflement. They obviously know what Iran is up to. Whether they agree with the war or not is another thing. But clearly, even Keir Starmer announced, that Iran had, or the UK secret services had foiled over 20 terror plots by Iran against the UK in just the past year. So everyone knows that it is on some level a threat to the UK. I think whether strategically they think it's wise to intervene is a different question. But I think, the general population feels baffled, and I think people are upset about their energy bills. I think is the other factor, because we're much more implicated, in the closure of the Straits of Hormuz, of the Strait of Hormuz, because we don't have energy independence in the way that the United States does. I was going to ask you about that, actually. I mean, that is obviously energy is a big question of this war, certainly for Europe. But how is it seen in the US? I mean, you are more insulated over there from the effects of this war, and certainly from the Iranian retaliation.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, yeah, not as impacted as much as Europe. That makes a lot of sense to me. But yeah, I mean, just driving, past gas stations, you see gas now at, $4 plus a gallon. That's impacting the average everyday American every single day. So it's not nothing. And any disruptions in that strait are obviously going to make the markets nervous. So it is, a cost benefit analysis, I think. And the hope that I have is, even though that there's this short-term pain, removing the ability of this regime for us to, wake up every day and see the threats that are, obviously threats are coming to the UK. I've lived with these threats just like the whole world has, and I've been more tuned into it, during my time in the military. So seeing that you've got this regime that's threatening us, saying they're going to, kill Americans, they're going to destroy Israel. It's like, it's kind of exhausting to hear that. So maybe the thought of removing that from the equation will then at some point make the markets recover to a place where they're even, the energy is even more affordable than it was before. So hopefully we're looking at some short-term pain for something that will let things settle out to be a little more just calm of a world overall. We have North Korea who's, constantly, threatening us, throwing everybody's nervous system off, saying that, there's going to be a ballistic missile launched towards the US or whatever, but they've kind of got China to keep them in check. China's like, okay, hey, North Korea, cause a little bit of pain, poke the US a little bit, but not too much. Like, they're going to keep them in line, right? But Iran doesn't have that. So Iran kind of, they don't have that big superpower that's keeping them in check. So their ability to cause a longer term problem, I think, is more something that Americans are aware of. But I think we're also, in America, people are questioning the war as well. So
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you about China, actually, because of course, China was the focus of the United States national security strategy that was published last year. But also, as you mentioned earlier, Chinese air defenses have been bought by Iran, but they seem to have been overpowered with relative ease. Is that because China is perhaps not as invested in Iran as maybe Iran hoped, or is this genuinely, a failing on the part of the Chinese? Perhaps is the Chinese technology not as advanced as we might have thought? What's your reading on that?
I think it's a little bit of both. That's a really great question. I made a video yesterday, and I was just doing a deep dive on what's the ultimate behind the scenes reason for this conflict. So I'll start with kind of the first part of your question with the different systems from China. They're not slouches. Obviously, China focuses heavily on defense. I mean, I remember through some of my military schools, this was an unclassified briefing where this professor came in and just gave us a diagram of one of the bases that China was building in the South China Sea. And it was a bunker underneath an island that went down 200 feet, just on a random, they took a coral reef, built a base on top of it, and they went down 200 feet. It's just wild, that amount of focus on the South China Sea and military capability. And so I think it's a battle of engineers at a certain point. How good are China's engineers? How well do they understand America's capability? How well can America keep those systems and tactics and engineering under wraps and not allow China to know how our systems work? It's really a battle of these big brain engineers at Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and these places where they're literally every day figuring out how to defeat China's air defenses. Because if you know how to defeat China and Russia's air defenses, then Venezuela's or Iran's are going to be easy, because likely China's not going to export the absolute top of the line to these different countries, right? That's just military 101. You don't export your top of the line military capability. You can export good military capability, but like the F-22 for the US, we don't export that because that's the king predator of the sky. You don't want everybody to have that. So same mentality with Russia and China. Oil is important. Obviously, the flow of oil to the world is important. When it comes to Iran having a nuclear weapon, keeping them from having that's important. But if you look at who's getting most of that oil, it's China. China's getting the lion's share of the oil from Iran. And they also are one of the biggest controllers, I think they're the biggest controller of rare earth minerals. Their focus on rare earth minerals is very strategic, and it's very smart. In Afghanistan, for example, they control a lot of the mines in northern Afghanistan, which are rich with rare earth minerals. And they've struck deals. This is even before the US pulled out of Afghanistan. They struck deals with Afghanistan itself to control those mines. And so their focus is rare earth minerals. So if now they're in control of rare earth minerals and they have a extremely friendly Chinese regime in Tehran, now they're basically controlling a lot of the world's oil as well. So now they've got both. So if you really think of the strategic implications of this conflict, I think one of the biggest benefactors is Taiwan, because if China can't just fully control that flow of oil out of the Straits of Hormuz, executing a war without oil is very tough, as you can imagine, right? So if the US can have a more friendly, we just saw President Trump post on Truth Social this morning that there is a less radicalized regime that he's discussing with. If it's a less China-friendly regime, or at least China has to think twice about whether they're going to continue to get the oil or not, I think this is just strategically, I think they're going to sit back and say, ooh, yeah, maybe Taiwan, maybe we need to delay that a little bit, because the rumors are they wanted to take Taiwan in 2027. That's kind of a well-known rumor that it just looked strategically like that's where it was lining up to happen. So China taking Taiwan, I mean, the different facilities there that manufacture microchips, the ability of that to control the world's economy it can't be understated. So if China takes Taiwan and now they fully own the flow of oil, because they pretty much do in Iran with the previous regime. So now if they don't, that's a really big factor for Xi Jinping to step back and say, ooh, yeah, maybe the whole Taiwan thing, we're good for now. And maybe it delays that by 20, 30 years or even further down the line.
And sticking with the sort of technology question, I mean, a lot of people have talked about this as the first AI war, and not just in terms of the sort of slop propaganda that's been coming out of the Iranian regime, but in terms of also some of the weaponry that's been deployed. Has there been anything that surprised you, that's been novel, that you thought is interesting and worth commenting on?
Well, AI, I think there's so many uses for it. I mean, just even from a human intelligence perspective, tracking the different patterns of life of these members of the IRGC, top level leadership, drones using AI to figure out who's who, that's likely going on right now as we speak. Something that I'm thinking this will actually expedite is usage of undersea drone technology that uses AI. So there's a system that's recently been released by Lockheed Martin. It's called the Lamprey. I don't have any connection to Lockheed Martin. I'm not sponsored by them, okay? But when I look at these different systems, I think about, okay, the capability of these lampreys. They're underwater sea leeches, basically. They're an evolution of the UUV, which is an underwater unmanned vehicle. And those are what Iran has been using to strike some of the ships with as well. If you see some of the ships that have been struck that have holes by the bottom of the ship itself, that's likely not a drone. That's likely some sort of underwater vehicle that's coming in and hitting that. So if you have some sort of a system underneath the surface, like the Lamprey, I mean, your viewers can just go to YouTube and look up Lamprey, Lockheed Martin. This thing has the ability to talk with swarms of themselves, and they can just rest on the seabed. They can sit down there, track. They can do what's called find, fix, track, and target the different UUVs being launched by the IRGC itself. So if you have a swarm of these things in the Straits of Hormuz that are just down there kind of waiting, this is, I don't think maybe it exists now. I mean, but if not, I think we're going to see a big evolution on things like this becoming more mainstream in certain waterways that you have to protect, even protecting ports in the US, protecting ports in the UK, because I think that's kind of the next battlefield with a lot of these terrorist tactics, is to get more advanced at striking energy infrastructure. So instead of just drone swarms up above using AI, think drone swarms down below using AI. I think that's probably one of the big things. And these underwater sea leeches, the Lamprey, can latch on to ships and just go with them and maybe wait and see, what's the ship doing? Is it dropping off mines? What is it up to? And then it can go to the surface and actually launch drones of its own to do ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So I think that's the next frontier for AI, is to be used underwater.
We've also seen what certainly surprising, maybe it's not surprising, but it's surprising to me, use of some quite old technology. You did a really interesting video about the US's use of B-52s, which I think a lot of people will be thinking of the Second World War in reference to that. What does that say? I mean, is that a sign of America's strength? Presumably, it's not that they're running out of planes.
Right. No, the B-52. This is something that I really have thought about a lot when it comes to warfare. It started when I was in Afghanistan, just thinking of the economics of warfare. What kind of systems do you use to hit certain targets? And a lot of times it's not the most technologically advanced. Sometimes it is. If you need to drop those big 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs with stealth, without air supremacy, the B-2 can go in there and do that. That's like the higher end of advanced technology. There's the B-21, which is being designed now to do similar missions of the B-2. But a lot of times when it comes to fighting against terrorist regimes, it's about what's the objective. So the A-10 Warthog, shooting down Shahed drones, striking fast attack craft. I like that because you're kind of meeting the enemy where they're at from a strategic warfare perspective. You don't need an F-35 up there shooting down Shahed drones with a $1 million missile. Like in warfare, there's something called economy of force. I learned this in year 2 of military studies in college, right? Economy of force matters. So I'll get to your question about the B-52, because some people are like, well, B-52 is massive. It's probably not that economical to fly. Yes and no, because what the B-52 can do is once you have air superiority, instead of sending in 12 fighter aircraft, think about the different jet engines, the maintenance, all the things that go into 12 fighter aircraft versus one B-52, and you can likely carry about the same payload in a B-52 as a dozen fighter aircraft, right? So once you have air superiority, then you bring in that truck that can carry 70,000 pounds of ordnance. And if you have the IRGC's targets, you know where they're at. You want to prepare the coastline for maybe special operations forces. The B-52 can go in and just decimate production facilities and do it all in one swoop instead of multiple waves of 12 fighters going in and doing the same thing. So to me, there is an economy of force there involved with the B-52, and it's a testament to that airframe, the rigidity of that thing. You know, coming up on, I think it's close to 80 years old at this point, or it's about to enter its eighth, or about 80 years old. So that being able to do that is a testament to building aircraft that get the job done. They might not look the prettiest, they might not be the sexiest, but at some point you got to just get the job done.
And finally, I just wanted to ask: is there anything that is there anything that people misunderstand the most about this war, this particular conflict? You know, what is there anything that has you having your head butt against the wall that you feel the need to explain all the time that people might not otherwise know?
Man, there's so much, Fraser. I feel like we could talk for another hour on that. But I mean, I try to focus on the military side of things. Ultimately, Iran's military has been decimated, but it's a tough problem to solve when you have 100 to 200,000 hardline IRGC members that have been basically holding their country hostage for decades. So I think one of the things I think about is, what is the world willing to tolerate, right? Are we willing to have these radical clerics in charge of nuclear weapons? Is that something we're okay with? I think the US has, basically spoken up very resolutely and said, this isn't a threat we're willing to deal with, and we can do something about it, right? Because there's going to come a time with Iran, just from what I've studied, that their goal was to have 10,000 plus ballistic missiles. So if they have 10,000 plus ballistic missiles and a nuclear weapon, and who knows how many countless drones they could get to, then at that point, they basically create their own little iron dome over top of their country, and they have the nuclear weapon. And then do we think that the radical clerics one day would wake up and decide, hey, we're going to go out with a bang and we're going to use this? Likely on Tel Aviv is where they'd likely use it. So obviously Israel has a big interest here. But at the end of the day, no one wants a nuclear war to happen, or even the chance of that. I think about my kids. Do I want them 10, 15 years down the road to be in a situation with Iran where we can't do anything about it? Because imagine we've seen Iran strike back, and they're not nothing, right? They're not. We can't minimize the fact that they're still getting hits with ballistic missiles. We just saw an AWACS taken down a couple days ago in Saudi Arabia. That's that advanced radar plane from the US. So imagine what they're doing now with what's said to be about 1,000 ballistic missiles left. Imagine what they could be doing with 10,000 ballistic missiles. Well, then at that point, you might not be able to base aircraft anywhere in the region, and that's going to be a much harder problem, if not impossible. So I think a lot of it is, are we willing to allow them to get to that point? And I think the US has stood up and said, no, we're not willing to let that happen. So a lot of people I've heard say, oh, everybody's just doing this for Israel. And okay, like if that's your perspective, yeah, obviously Israel has a big stake in this. Like obvious, that's obvious. But I think we've talked about some of the strategic implications for the rest of the world if we allow this to happen. And a lot of it, I think there's a lot of people in Taiwan that are very appreciative of what's going on here as well. And that's not being talked about either.
Ryan Bodenheimer, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Fraser's a pleasure. Thank you so much.